Street Fighter II, the legendary title that would not only help set the blueprint for all fighting games to come, but also function as the video game that is often credited with rejuvenating the entire arcade industry. At this point, calling the game iconic would be an understatement, with the impact of Street Fighter's popularity still being felt to this day. Street Fighter II The World Warrior set many trends in fighters, such as the inclusion of a large playable roster of fighters, deep rich movesets, huge sprites, and of course one-on-one fighting. But these were not the only innovations that would come from the classic, as Street Fighter II would set a further trend, one of which tends to cause a lot more debates. I am talking about the introduction of releasing and selling the same video game over and over and over again, with updates, tweaks and alterations. Whenever a new version of Street Fighter II has been released, questions have risen with regards to whether the latest edition of a game is worth a purchase, or whether a new version of a game simply exists so that Capcom can continue to milk their big fat fighting game cash cow. 26 years after Street Fighter II's initial release, the most recent iteration of the classic fighter would raise eyebrows once again, quickly appearing to many gamers as perhaps Capcom's most unapologetic cash grab with their franchise as of yet. So what was it about this one that makes it more shameless than what came before it? And why do so many believe that purchasing this version was stupid? Holding these thoughts in mind, let me say to you, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Ultra Street Fighter 2. One Street Fighter 2 iteration too many. Yeah. To be able to understand the crazy road to Ultra Street Fighter 2, let's quickly recap the history of Street Fighter 2 updates. Just 1 year after the World Warrior's initial release, 1992 would deliver Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, a version of the game where players could play as the 4 boss characters from the game, along with palette swaps of previous playable fighters, allowing for mirror matches for the first time. The game would also be rebalanced, making gameplay tighter than ever. Later that same year, the game would be updated yet again with the release of Street Fighter 2 Turbo Hyper Fighting, a much faster version of the game featuring new moves, further rebalancing and refinement. Hyper Fighting was produced in response to Rainbow Edition, an illegal Taiwanese hack of Street Fighter 2 that was captivating players with its extreme speed. 1993 would see yet another new iteration of the game introduced, Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers. This version of the game was programmed to run on Capcom's shiny new Capcom System 2 arcade board, and would introduce 4 completely new fighters. Utilising the new hardware, this version of the game includes more sophisticated music and gameplay, with further balancing and features being added. The following year of 1994 would see Street Fighter 2 re-released once again, this time as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. One of the game's main selling points was the inclusion of Akuma as a secret unlockable character, who was inspired by the virality of the Shenlong hoax. But further to this, a super meter would be introduced along with combination moves such as super combos and air combos, changing Street Fighter 2 forever. Now these are the reiterations of a game that everyone tends to remember due to the fact that each was released at the franchise's height of popularity, which spanned between the release of the original 1991 arcade edition of the game through to the 1994 live-action movie. This was the classic Street Fighter Golden Age. Past this point, the Street Fighter Alpha series was born, the Capcom crossover games for Street Fighter EX games, Street Fighter 3 games, and more. It seemed for now at least that Capcom had finally left their classic behind to focus on newer fighting games featuring their famous cast. Still, the game will continue to show up in disc compilations through this period, and in the year 2000, a matching service version of Street Fighter 2 Turbo saw release in Japan. A Dreamcast version of the now classic that allowed gamers to experience Street Fighter 2 online for the first time. Progressing slightly further into the dawn of the new millennium, the first true new iteration of Street Fighter 2 in 7 years would surface, known as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Revival. This was an exclusive created for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, and a title that made a lot of sense considering that the GBA was home to many classics from the 16-bit era that had been revived and given fresh coats of paint, including new features, so this update felt right. Controls were modified to suit the Game Boy Advance's more simplistic 4-button layout, new characters' artwork was added, and a range of new stages had been added to the game from both the Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter 3 series, all in all offering up a really quirky handheld version of an all-time great. 2 years later, in 2003, the game that just keeps coming back would return to both home consoles and the arcade with the release of Hyper Street Fighter 2, the Anniversary Edition. Capcom had noted in the past that many gamers had their preference with regards to which of the 5 classic iterations of the game they liked best, so Hyper Street Fighter 2 would innovate by allowing its users to switch between characters who could be controlled like they were in a version of the player's choice. Hyper Street Fighter 2 would be the 6th arcade version of the classic, and the last video game to ever see release that utilised Capcom's now aged Capcom System 2 board. By 2004, Capcom had begun to note that a large proportion of the general public now seemed to have fighting game fatigue, with them finding that less and less interest was being shown by consumers when it came to their new fighting game releases. When it comes to Street Fighter, the Street Fighter 3 game sold terribly, Street Fighter EX proved to be unpopular on the PS2, and Capcom Fighting Evolution seemed to be a title that everyone wanted to forget about. But strangely, while people didn't seem interested in new fighting games anymore, they noticed that somehow Street Fighter 2 was surging in popularity once more. A combination of factors was driving this, for example the rise of retro gaming itself, and adults wanting to go back and enjoy the titles of their childhood. However, there was a further factor that would drive it as well, an online version of Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting, which saw a release for Xbox 360 in 2006. With this downloadable game proving to be hugely popular, Street Fighter 2 would just simply not go away. This turn of events would of course result in Capcom seeing dollar signs and quickly making the decision that if they can't make more money from new fighting games, they're just instead produce yet another iteration of Street Fighter 2, bringing us along to one of the most important versions of Street Fighter 2 in today's tale, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix. This 2008 game, like the Xbox Live version of Hyper Fighting that had already proven popular, would be a downloadable only title, being made available to play on both the Xbox 360 and Sony PlayStation 3. This version of the game was pretty special really, and offered some pretty substantial changes to what players knew and loved. You see, as aside from containing the regular version of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the game would include an all-new high-definition version of an all-time great, featuring graphics drawn by Udon Entertainment, the same company responsible for a huge number of amazing Street Fighter mangas. Pair this with the new arrangements of the Street Fighter 2 soundtrack that was handled by Overclocked Remix, and you get one impressive affair. The new version of Street Fighter 2 would be designed by David Serlin of Backbone Entertainment, who had pitched a redrawn version of Street Fighter 2 during the development of Capcom Classics Collection. Further to this, with the rising popularity of Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting on Xbox Live, Capcom's Senior Director of Strategic Planning and Research, Christian Svensson, revealed that fans on the company's forums had asked for a high-definition Street Fighter game an overwhelming amount of times. The game that Serlin would design would be a heavily modified version of an iteration of Street Fighter 2 we mentioned earlier, the matching service version of the game that had previously seen release on the Sega Dreamcast. Serlin would take the game and implement balance changes and correct differences between the original version of the game and the new HD mode. Laborious tasks included monitoring speed differences between the versions and the addition of the new features. As for the gameplay, its multiplayer modes include local multiplayer, player match and ranked matches along with online tournaments. A hitbox display in training mode was also introduced to help show players how their moves connect. Quarter match mode was also brought in, letting players spectate and instantly join online match lobbies, replicating an arcade-like environment. Earlier I touched on the music from Overclocked Remix, who have a website for video game tribute music. They were hand-picked to handle the music by producer of the game, Ray Jimenez, who had heard their work before. Capcom's Vice President of Strategic Planning and Business Development, Christian Svensson, described the soundtrack as impactful after guests to whom he showed a demo of the game praised the remixed music before any other aspect of the demo. The game, released at a budget price point, would be lauded by many critics for what it managed to bring to the table, with many publications going as far as to call it the best all-round version of one of the most important fighting games of all time. The fact that one of the most popular video games of all time had been classily redrawn and was ready to play online at an extremely cheap price point would quickly help Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix break all sorts of records, including it breaking both first day and first week sales for a download only title. Street Fighter 2 had made history once again. The success that Street Fighter 2 had been enjoying on online services had provided Capcom with enough evidence that they finally considered it financially viable again to begin producing all new Street Fighter titles, eventually resulting in the release of Street Fighter 4, an all new game which still chose to heavily lean into Street Fighter 2 nostalgia, which in turn led to Street Fighter 4 being the best selling Street Fighter game since, well, Street Fighter 2. So, with the Street Fighter franchise well and truly revived, this would lead to a period whereby Capcom would make multiple iterations of Street Fighter 4 and later Street Fighter 5 with its waves and waves of DLC. Which raises the question, where did this leave Street Fighter 2? Our question would finally be answered in 2017, when we would receive the most recent edition of the game, Ultra Street Fighter 2 The Final Challengers. The problem was, though, by this point, what was there really left to do? What direction would be taken next? Let's find out. Well, like is normally usual with Street Fighter 2, the most recent edition of the game, in this title's case, Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo Remix, would be taken, then built on, before seeing another release, thus meaning that gamers would receive a Street Fighter 2 game with two graphical styles once again. Unlike the previous version that had been outsourced to be produced by Backbone Entertainment, Ultra Street Fighter 2 would be developed in-house at Capcom, with the famous Yoshinori Ono of Street Fighter 4 and 5 fame serving as the game's producer. In fact, staff would be used who had experience working on both Street Fighter 5 and Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, resulting in a fairly varied team. The game would be announced as a Nintendo Switch exclusive and would function as part of Street Fighter's 30th anniversary celebration. Visiting Street Fighter 2 once again, Yoshinori Ono mentions the game was developed to bring the franchise back to its roots, or in other words, milk the cash cow that just keeps on giving. As for changes, the Capcom team would take the Backbone Entertainment title, then reportedly continue to retune and rebalance it, even going as far as to adjust combo timings from the original games and add in grapple breaks. Further new features include allowing support for the Nintendo Switch platform's varied control schemes, including single Joy-Con play. Like HD Remix before it, online play modes are present, but more quirkily, a local co-op mode has been added. To put it simply, this functions in the same way dramatic battles do within the Street Fighter Alpha series, known in this game's instance as buddy battles, whereby 2-on-1 encounters can take place. In an absurd twist, the game also contains what is known as Way of the Hado mode, a strange section whereby you can play as Ryu from a first-person perspective and must defeat as many Shadaloo soldiers as possible. Essentially functioning as little more than a Joy-Con minigame, this peculiar mode features Street Fighter V style graphics and looks completely out of place in the title that allegedly was produced to bring Street Fighter 2 back to its roots. Weird. Another gimmick the game contains is a colour editor mode, allowing players to make up their own alternate colour palettes for any fighter in the game. The most noticeable addition to this entire fighting game affair is the title's increased roster count from 17 fighters up to 19. But rather than including two completely fresh new characters for the first time since 1994, instead Capcom chose to lazily just make variants of both Ken and Ryu. Ryu is now playable in his evil form, first established in 1996 during Street Fighter Alpha 2, and then we have the ridiculously named Violent Ken. I've probably said this multiple times before on this channel, but Ken is from a frickin' fighting game franchise. I have never seen a game whereby Ken isn't being violent. He spends his whole time on screen fighting people, for goodness sake. So why Capcom couldn't have come up with a more appropriate name for his evil alter ego is beyond me. While never appearing in a mainline Street Fighter game before this point, Violent Ken has been present in the mangas for years and was playable in the crossover fighting game known as SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos. Unlike evil Ryu, who is said to have succumbed to the Dark Shadow, Violent Ken is said to utilise Psycho powers, the same energy as M. Bison. Placing Violent Ken and evil Ryu in Street Fighter 2 was probably the least effort option to include new characters, and I use the term new characters very lightly. Finally, for those like myself who are into Street Fighter's rich history and lore, the game does contain over 1,400 illustrations from the art book, known as Street Fighter 20 The Art of Street Fighter. The game's gallery mode also gives players the option to listen to all the different music arrangements from the game. Remember, Guile's theme goes with everything. So keeping all this in mind, the game is basically Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix with a couple of extras, including the embarrassing Violent Ken. So holding this information, why do so many consider this iteration a step too far, and the most shameless cash grab in Street Fighter 2 history? I mean, there are a lot of iterations, so what was the big problem here that everyone had with this one? Well, the simple answer comes down to one word: pricing. The pricing of this game was bloody ridiculous and is a classic example of Capcom making themselves look greedy and a tad predatory. As mentioned just now, this game is basically just an update of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix, a game that Capcom didn't invest a great deal of money into, since it was a budget remake of a now retro game. This meant that HD Remix was released as a downloadable only game, available at an extremely cheap price point, which in turn helped it sell so well. In fact, to give you an idea of how affordable this game was, in 2012 Capcom would release a physical version of it as part of the Capcom Digital Collection for Xbox 360. Discs contained 8 titles that had previously only been available for Xbox owners via their download service, but this collection allowed players to pick up all of them at once for pennies. When we take into account that HD Remix had been reduced to compilation game status 5 years earlier, that meant that in 2017, the release of Ultra Street Fighter 2 on Nintendo Switch as a full-price $40 game was all the more perplexing. Getting to play as Violent Ken should not even come close to costing that much money, so no wonder people were outraged. A phrase that I often hear thrown around is that if you want to play a game on a Nintendo console, then you need to pay a Nintendo Premium. However, it would not be long before Capcom would release another title for the Switch that would compound that Ultra Street Fighter 2 was a rip-off even further. Just 12 months later, Switch owners would gain the option to buy the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection, an amazing offering put together by Digital Eclipse, who would place 13 Street Fighter games together on one cartridge, including 6 iterations of Street Fighter 2, the original 1987 game, along with the Street Fighter 3 and Alpha series. If Capcom looked greedy with Ultra Street Fighter 2, then with the Anniversary Collection they looked generous. But by doing so, the pricing point of the final challenges looked even more ludicrous comparatively. It made no sense why it was so expensive, making it, in my opinion, the stupidest version of Street Fighter 2 in history. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, that was the unaccountably expensive Ultra Street Fighter 2. Let me know in the comments as to why you think they made that game so expensive. But please stay with me and check out my video on Capcom's Saturday Night Slam Master Trilogy right now. Cheerio!